You're on the air. Don't say anything crazy. And we're live. Right, so today, Brother Bear, the topic we're going to be bloody discussing is Buddhism. Where does Buddhism fit in the modern world? How can we bring it into our daily lives to improve ourselves, those around us, and society?
Hey up, lad. That sounds like a lovely, wholesome topic to round off 2020, which, you know, for many reasons has been a difficult year for many.
I think difficult is a word that you can interchange with terrible, atrocious, and absolutely shite.
Yeah.
On many levels.
Absolutely.
It's one of those years that, as they say, the bar has been set very low.
Yes, I think we're all hoping to go into 2021, make the most. I think we're realising more than ever how precious our time is, and, you know, probably some of the teachings of Buddhism would be good to heed going into the next year.
Yes, yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. Buddhism is the religion of no religion. It's been titled that just because it's less about divinity or self-worship or even adhering to a very rigid set of principles, but it's more about sort of walking the Tao, and Taoism and Buddhism flow into one another to some degree, and sort of floating on the lily of life. As vague as that sounds, the more that you burrow into that and meditate into that, there's actually a lot of very reassuring and therapeutic teachings that can come from that.
Yeah, that was one of the impressions I got, and I was quite surprised when I first fully understood that concept, that it's not a very rigid religion as far as religions go. Actually, you know, if you look at things like the Dalai Lama, I think he was asked sort of if there was scientific evidence that refuted some of the beliefs of Buddhism, would you be willing to look into them? And he said, absolutely. You know, it'd be stupid not to. So it's sort of that radical open-mindedness from a religious standpoint. I've not seen any religion quite like it, or at least open to the idea of revisiting dogma and willing to, well, I suppose, fundamentally change dogma according to what the prevailing scientific data might be showing or indicating.
Yes, that's quite rare. And we live in a time as well where the Abrahamic religions that are more black and white are actually becoming more and more popular. So for example, Islam is very much overtaking Protestantism in its popularity. And I think that there's some quite obvious reasons behind that. One of which is, I think this is a kind of a time of dissonance and disorder, and polarization and alienation. So we've seen that sort of in the way that finance is distributed. We've seen that in the way that people are so uncompromising and polarized in their political views. So I think that people are sort of also being pushed towards more extreme ideas in the Abrahamic religious world, and the reason I wanted to talk about this is because Buddhism is sort of sat there in the corner quietly, and it's not gaining very much traction, but it's definitely there in the background, working away when people need that place of refuge, spiritual refuge and emotional refuge.
Yeah. No, you're quite right about the Abrahamic religions. They're much more sort of traditional in the sense of what a religion is and what it constitutes. I remember that there was that film, I don't know if you've seen it, The Two Popes, and in that film they were sort of looking at the interesting contrasting dynamics and leadership styles and beliefs of Pope Francis versus Pope Benedict, and one of the sort of Pope Benedict was all about dogma and, you know, staying the course and holding hard on to centuries of beliefs and values, and sort of the reason he did so was because he believed sort of if you became or swayed too much to today's social dynamics and ideologies, you'd basically become irrelevant in the next iteration or generation of ideologies, and you can't allow a religion to bend to that extent, because essentially a religion is supposed to be quite firm and rigid. It's not supposed to be swaying according to the whims of one generation to the next.
Yes. That's a very interesting way of looking at it. I've not considered that before. I think that's quite an astute point, because we're in quite a faddy time. Whether you're looking at politics, the ideas around identity, technology, everyone I feel is trying to one up and keep up with the latest zeitgeist. And I think that is very much at odds with traditional Abrahamic religion. So not saying, to be completely dogmatic, but I think there's some sense to, not necessarily being compromising, because you become irrelevant in the next 20, 30, 40 years, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I suppose there needs to be some sort of consistency, year on year, decade on decade, century on century. Otherwise, I suppose it ceases to become a religion and maybe just becomes maybe just the prevailing social dynamics and beliefs at the time, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that when we talk about Abrahamic religions, it's, when we're talking about Judaism, Catholicism, Islam, there one great quote is that the teaching of Buddhism can awaken anyone. So fundamentally, you can have Jewish Buddhas, you can have Catholic Buddhas, you can have secular Buddhas. This is by no means a doctrine or a way of life that is just exclusive to Buddhists. If you understand what the Zen is, and you understand that it's the true nature of expressing oneself moment by moment, then whatever your religion, you can be a Buddhist. And that's the beautiful thing about it being the religion of no religion.
Yeah, I suppose it's colourless in that sense, and I suppose it therefore doesn't alienate any one person, even if they are of a particular religious persuasion already. You can sort of almost integrate Buddhist teachings into your current framework. Is that right?
Yeah, you can to a very large extent. It's a flexible religion, and I think that's why it stood the test of time. The original Prince Siddhartha Gautama sort of came up with the ideas behind Zen Buddhism some 2,500 years ago. So it's comparatively newer than a lot of Abrahamic religions. Well, a couple that come to mind. And it carries a sort of flexible and accommodating attitude towards different cultures, different religions and beliefs. And that's why it was able to be adapted very well into Western culture. And to be used, by people who actually follow a Christian faith or people who follow a secular faith. So I think that, the title of this podcast is going to surround modern Buddhism. We're going to talk a little bit about, some of the underlying doctrines, or if you can even call them that, because they're less than dogmatic. But the title is Modern Buddhism because it's so flexible and adaptable.
It's very interesting. One of my previous flatmates, his brother apparently was a Buddhist, and he said he was a Buddhist for a number of years. I don't know whether he was still at the time, but it sounds like something you can somewhat drop in and out of. It's not something like, I suppose, in the Abrahamic religions you'd expect a man, and it usually is a man, to be a rabbi or priest for their since from their ordination right up until death, and basically essentially it's a set of vows for life.
It's certainly very different to that. I mean, what I'll say is that it's not dogmatic. It doesn't demand a dedication to divinity for, say, an ordained minister. But I will say that if you don't practice it regularly, you will forget about it, and you'll stop to take and reap the benefits of it. So first and foremost, the sort of meditative aspects of it, and certain practices, whether it's the way you treat others and yourself, whether it's practicing yoga and practicing that through a more Buddhist lens. If you give it, say, a year without doing that, then you can't really claim to be a Buddhist. But it's certainly it's not something that yet demands some kind of divinity to an ordained minister or priest.
Yeah, okay, fine, that makes sense. Yeah, and I think this whole sort of idea of mindfulness sort of stems from Buddhist teachings, if I'm not wrong. And, you know, that can take multiple forms. You mentioned yoga, meditation, which is something that's increasingly being adopted into the psychological mainstream as a tool, and actually quite a potent tool if used correctly. And sort of the way I understood mindfulness, and I don't know if you want to get into this later, but was sort of just almost watching your thoughts, and watching them almost as a third-party spectator, sitting almost at a distance, watching your mind flick through thoughts, whether that's quite chaotic and sort of scrambled thoughts or quite logical, sequential, one-by-one thoughts, and maybe looking into what those thoughts are and allowing just for a moment, or those 10 or 15 minutes, whatever it is you're doing the meditation for that pond of the mind to still a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a very nice way of putting it. Mindfulness can be described in a lot of different ways. I think one of my favorites is that it's sort of the practice of paying attention to the present, the present moment. And I think that it's very sensory in that sense. And as you just said, Andre, it talks about, you know, the concentration on breathing methods and guided imagery in your mind. Yeah. And again, there's so many benefits that can come from that. But mindfulness is, I think, the biggest issue, especially in the West, in how we interpret mindfulness, or how we interpret Zen ideas, is that we try and place an intellectual look on it. And I know you and I have had a number of conversations where we've talked about the shortcomings of academia for the sake of academia. Yeah. And how sort of over complex, and you know, you get to this situation where you can't see the wood for the trees. Right. So right from the get-go with Zen and mindfulness, you need to park the brakes on the intellectual look and everything that every way we've been taught to interpret things through university and school, and actually just to stop and breathe, take full awareness of what's happening around you, even if it's nothing at all. Yeah,
I think you mentioned the breath there twice, and that was a key teaching from the psychologist I used to see, and he was talking about how focusing on the breath is sort of the focal point of the mindfulness exercise or the meditation. And if I are now sort of remembering, thinking back, he did say, you know, the thoughts will inevitably come and go, whatever they are. But you've just got to be careful not to sort of aggressively pull or get angry at yourself for being diverted inevitably, which is what will happen for many years as you begin to practice meditation and mindfulness, but almost guide yourself back to the breathing and the rhythm of your breath, and not trying to breathe in a rhythmic or sort of sequential manner, but just letting the breath breathe itself, and not, you know, trying to have an experience other than the one you're having. To just simply be and experience the thoughts. And if there are distracting thoughts, almost leading your mind away from those thoughts gently as opposed to aggressively, almost like you were to ask a child, be like, thank you, I've noticed the thought, we'll come back to that later. Now let's get back to the breathing we were doing.
Yeah, that's right. And I think you need to guide mindfulness and mindful breathing exercises with that lack of coercion and those, you know, very gentle pushes. And I think mindfulness as a practice very much flows into the idea of Zen. And obviously Zen is a word that's been kind of annoyingly popularized, you know, try to be Zen. I would try to be Zen when I'm being patient with my partner, or when I'm, you know, when I'm trying to get through my workload or whatever.
#Zen.
Right, exactly. But it's an ancient word.
Then.
Thou then
right now. Oh my God, my brunch was then. That is not your no. Don't even. I was going to go on a long line of expletives there, but I stopped myself rather than and engaged my own Zen.
Engaged your own Zen to avoid insulting Zen. or well, it's everyone has their own interpretation, right? And people jump on these hurrah words, but Zen in its essence is very similar to being mindful, because it's our true nature of expressing ourselves moment by moment, and realizing the joy of just being.
Yeah.
And it isn't a belief system. It's not a doctrine or a set of principles. It's, there's so many different terms for it. The absolute, ultimate reality. It's very much the direct experience of life. And then you have the practice of Zazen, which is meditation. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of, almost in a very purist way, experiencing the Zen. Because what you're doing there is you could have, in our Zen box, you could have, you're practicing archery. And this is what I would do. And I'd be out in the woods practicing archery. And only when I'm really in that absolute ultimate reality is when I put that arrow, the point of the arrow, right in that bullseye at 100 yards away. But when I experience the Zazen, it's that exact same energy, but we're talking about it in a meditative environment. So that can be anywhere. That can be on my bedroom floor. That can be when I'm waiting at the dentist, and that's where you, I suppose, also start to slowly, if you practice it well enough over years, is that you start to see yourself as interconnected with nature around you and all aspects of what the world and the universe is.
So it sounds like a key teaching of Zen is to very much be in the present moment, because that's probably, at least for me, harder than ever. And it's a weird phenomenon, because as children we do that anyway. We're the most in the moment I think we'll ever be in our lives, and I think we almost unlearn that, unfortunately, as we grow up, through sort of adult concerns and obligations and responsibilities. We can't afford to live in the now as much as we used to.
So unfortunately, that's the reality. We live in a capitalist system, and whether we like it or not, we are all capitalists, because we all engage in, processes of working and earning and saving. And you're right, more and more, you have to be thinking of the future, in these troubling times, but also in the past 20 years, we've seen successions of wage compression and all these other forces that basically make us, I guess you could say, save for today for a better tomorrow, or prepare for today for a better tomorrow, however you want to turn it. But those are some good practices in other areas of life, but sometimes they're very much at odds with the Zen because of the mental capacity that they take up. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think it's all too easy sort of to be continually worrying about the future and never truly experiencing the present, and then sort of in a paradoxical sense you never really experience anything because you're not really in the moment at that given point, because we really don't have the future. It's in no way guaranteed. The present moment kind of is all we have. The past is gone, the present is barely there, and then the future doesn't exist. So all you have is the present millisecond. So I think, it's such an invaluable teaching. And obviously with all of these things, it's easier said than done. But I think it's still something so valuable to truly experience whatever you're experiencing, whether it's as mundane as washing the dishes. You can find Zen in, and truly like being there and present in something as mundane as that, and find joy in that, probably. There's been moments where I find that as well.
Absolutely, because you can become you can become acutely aware of your breathing and just that one task, and there can be a lot of joy in that ultimate realism. There's that turn of phrase, a healthy person wants a million things, a sick person only wants one.
Yeah.
And there is some joy in that, just because the want of one thing, and say in this case that is to just solely focus on the present and not think about what about this or that outcome, what about all these issues that I may encounter in the future or have done in the past. that focus on the present is a very transformative process.
Yeah, yeah, but there's all too many distractions, to kind of pull you one way or the other. And even looking into the past, that there's a plethora of reasons why for you not to be engaged fully with the present. And I wonder, can you still be in sort of a mindfulness Zen state when really meaningfully engaged with, even if it's something like work or manual labor? I suppose if you're truly in that moment and not thinking about, you're only in that present moment, then that is a form of Zen as well, or not.
I think that is a form of Zen. I would say yes to that. And I've experienced it with the most mundane tasks in the previous job of answering emails. And just for a solid hour or two, I completely forgot who I was.
Yes.
And even though that was through a ridiculous medium, or a very sad medium, or whatever you want to call it, don't focus on the medium for a second. The fact that I forgot who I was, and in a sense I kind of lost my ego, even though it was an hour or two. That kind of distraction actually completely decluttered my mind.
Yeah, that's very true. I suppose when you're completely meaningfully and utterly engaged with something in the moment, then it really does, there is a sort of mild ego death that happens. And I completely relate to that. And sort of, if I look back when I used to draw and paint, then there were times when, 2 hours would go by, but I didn't feel them, but because I was so in the moment, but it wasn't me painting, but it was. And I think that was sort of that, or what they call the flow state, but it's just when you're completely in the moment and time seems to distort.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you will also find as a byproduct of that, even though this wasn't your goal, is you will get maximum efficiency in what you're doing.
Yeah.
You'll reach your true north, and whether that's painting or doing archery, learning a language, answering emails, doing the dishes, you will get that maximum efficiency. And 100%. That's why, and in previous times, in times of antiquity, that's why and again I'm referencing archery, but the Buddhist monks that practiced it referred to it as the mystical flight of the arrow, in their in their native Sanskrit, and that was because they became the arrow. They reached maximum efficiency. They forgot who they were, in the sense that they suffered, or rather enjoyed, that ego death.
And just tell me about, because you've been practicing archery. It's really quite a cool hobby, and I suppose something you've have the luxury of taking up in somewhere like with lots of outdoors and the opportunity to practice in somewhere like Canada, Alberta. And just tell me about how that's maybe taught you, or you can see maybe elements of Zen and mindfulness in the archery itself, and even in through talk me through the motions and what parts of it sort of, and when you snap out of that Zen trance almost.
Yeah, I think that what I would sum up as where I'm getting to with archery is sort of almost, it sounds quite funny to most, I'm sure, but an out-of-body experience, and a oneness with the arrow, the string, the drawstring, the bow, and the target that I'm hitting. So these are all kind of, one could see them as kind of quite vague phrases, but it's kind of a magical moment that's beyond life, beyond Earth, and what happens is, from my perspective, when I've got that arrow in my hand and I'm drawing it back and I'm focusing on that target, and I'm continuing that old adage of aim small, miss small, which is a very much a popular term amongst hunters, shooters, trappers, archers, and that is focusing on such a fine point that if you miss, you are still to some degree going to succeed in the flight path of the projectile. You are on that sort of spiritual mission to get that arrow, that tip of the arrow, into whatever you're shooting at, whether it's the crease of the the white-tailed deer's back, or whether it's at that tiny red dot that you've painted on a tree. So that's when you draw that arrow back, and you're taking, could be 10 to 20 seconds just to focus on that very fine point. Then you reach your stream of consciousness. You reach that level of spiritual awareness, which, by the way, is when you're starting to suffer the ego death. And then you just plunge into yourself and nature all around you. So that would be sort of my sensory description of an archery trip. So, and it's a complete commitment to the Zen, really.
Yeah, I suppose it almost sounds like the way you're talking about it, and almost a whole spectrum and arc of experience in the space of about 30 seconds or a minute.
Yeah, and the beauty of it is you're not even trying. It's nothing that requires deep intellectual thought.
Yeah, exactly.
It's nothing. It doesn't require studying, and you know what? It doesn't even require that much experience beyond just doing the same action again and again, and having that goal in mind. Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. It's great that you found something like that. It's really engaged that Zen and mindfulness.
Yeah, and I think, not to go on an archery tangent, because it's one activity I do, but it's an activity that in the modern world was actually developed by the understanding of Native Americans and how they practiced archery and how they basically became really accurate. And have you heard? I may have mentioned this to you before, Brother Bear, but the story of Ishi.
I think you've told me about it. Yeah, but do remind me.
Just the capture of, if you need a refresher on this, it's basically just the capture of the last of the Yoni Indians in Orville, California, and it was 1911, and at that time there was a bounty on Native Americans in 1911, so you could capture one and basically get money for bringing them into custody. So these were very dark times for natives.
Crazy.
Yeah, and it's not that long ago. But when they captured Ishi, I think it was Pope and Young studied him. Pope and Young were very avid archers, and I think it was Art Young was actually, he came from San Jose University, one of the universities in California. He was I suppose he was a paleontologist, and he was a studier of different peoples throughout history. But anyway, they took Ishi's, I suppose, spiritual relationship or Zen relationship with archery to create modern bow hunting and modern archery.
Wow, so they took all of those learnings. Well, it sounded like up until that point, the Native Americans were probably far more in touch with what archery meant and I suppose the point of archery in the first place, whereas the Europeans probably would have seen it, the common folk, as a weapon out for warfare, right?
Yeah, I think so, and I think that still stands today. I mean, I know natives or First Nations people in Canada who are actually, for the winter season, they hunt, and that's their source of meat. Never step foot in a Walmart or a Target. It's you hunt you hunt a moose and 3 deer, and you're good to go until April.
Wow.
I know a fellow who that's exactly how he gets his food for the winter. He's a Cree Indian from Alberta. So these are the methods of life and the relationship with nature that I suppose, whether we acknowledge them or not, have a very Zen, a very mindful sort of status. Or they're very mindful in their very essence.
Yeah. Robert, can you relate to the moment? Because, whether it's in my room as mundane as throwing, a scrunched up piece of paper into the waste paper basket, or just playing beer pong. Whenever you're throwing or projecting a projectile and aiming at something or trying to hit something, there's almost like this very narrow bandwidth of the mind space that if you hit it, you know it's going in or it's going to hit the target before it has. And it's just like almost an enlightenment of confidence that just like it's almost like you believe it so much that it hits, or it's a weird one. It's almost, if you believe it hard enough, there's a brief glimmer or a flash, a window where you can throw it and it will go in.
So you're saying you sort of preempt successfully landing that projectile by thinking you're going to do it,
right? But not even thinking, but knowing it's going in.
Yeah, I mean, what are you saying, Brother Bear? That kind of brings with it that's sort of part and parcel of a mindful practice.
Well, I don't know what it is, but I just wanted to see if you'd relate to it, because it's almost like it boils up and it's there for a flash, for a merely microsecond. And if you don't throw it at that very moment at which it peaks, then you won't miss, because as soon as it peaks, there is a single grain of doubt, and then you obviously miss. But it's just when you hit it at that accumulation point, at that peak point of belief that you are going to make the target, that it seems to make it. And if you don't, it's because there was a grain of doubt. And I don't know, I've experienced it maybe a single digit number of times in my life, but it was kind of profound enough for me to remember them all.
Yeah. I actually do relate to what you're saying, and I think my interpretation of that is actually mind chatter, particularly doubtful or negative mind chatter.
Yeah, I think you're right.
I think that's what you may be talking about, where you've got that overthinking, or you've got that ounce of doubt in your mind, and that actually makes the outcome the exact opposite of the one you want it to be.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's when you shut, it's rather like that. You've kind of spoken about the inverse of it, right? It's when you've silenced, then the pool is completely still and there's no negative mind chatter, not even a whisper. That's when you throw. And if you throw in that slim window, if you can generate that window, then you make the target.
Exactly. Yeah. Conversely, if you, as you just said, you make that slim window, you're gonna hit the target. And I think that's that is the case in different practices. That's the case, in hunting. That's the case in, the way that we speak to others and we come across to others. But it's particularly pronounced when you're talking about almost like a mathematical result. Did we get it or did we not? It's very binary. And I also think that sort of feeds into the joys of those kind of activities, because it's a yes or a no. There's no sort of cloud in the middle,
Yeah.
And Alan Watts would refer to that as sort of the prickly pursuits as opposed to the gooey pursuits. But there is a lot of joy in the prickly pursuits because, they're very binary. They're very yes, no.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think those sorts of prickly pursuits tend to be of a sports nature, or an example of those prickly pursuits are generally sports nature, because either you win or you lose, or you make the target or you fail to make the target. So and I think it helps with iterative improvement. It's one of the best things to work, because you can start to be quite analytical and be able to measure how far you are off the target and what you need to improve in order to make it next time. So, and I think it's one of those pursuits that lends itself to incremental improvement and is therefore quite a rewarding pursuit.
Yes, yeah, definitely incremental improvement, and continuously aiming small, missing small, and repeating that until you get to that level of just stupefying consistency. Yeah,
absolutely.
And I think pulling the conversation closer back to sort of the essence of Buddhism, and its early formation, I think we're talking about fairly loose concepts with Buddhism, but a lot of it really came forward from setting forth a middle way, and the middle way is that of between extremes. So on one side you got complete indulgence, and on the other side you've got asceticism. So severe self-discipline, avoidance of any form of indulgence, at any given point. So I think there's a lot of value to be taken from the middle way, when you're landing that arrow, or when you're making any kind of judgment in life.
Is that something, when we talk about the Tao, is the Tao relevant there, as in the yin and the yang, being able to straddle that thin tightrope between order and chaos?
I think that is the essence of the Tao, just because it's a realization of humans being only a small part of a larger process, of a larger nature, and the best actions that ultimately make sense are those of balance. So the Tao is to some degree that, but the Tao, meaning the way or the path, is also has very similar connotations to Zen ideas, because it's about following your true nature, and expressing yourself moment by moment.
Yeah, I can completely relate to that, and I think that's what a lot of sort of this generic self-help stuff owes its roots to Buddhism, but often is so misconstrued and sort of put into these cheesy one-line snippy bites, and they may work well for a marketing campaign, but they sort of muddy the waters in terms of the purity of the source, and what the intention was when it came from that source, right?
Yeah, and I think the source is in its essence, Buddhism is fairly vague. I'll be honest when I say it's open to interpretation. It is a religion of no religion, so that's going to be taken and abused by snake oil salesmen and different marketeers, different self-helpers.
Yeah, absolutely. And in today's social media age, people jump on that sort of thing. So, but it's I suppose because Buddhism is quite formless, shapeless, is there some sort of structure we can take a bite into?
Yeah, I'd say there's two structures with Buddhism. So, and this is also, as someone who quite enjoys structure, I think that the two that come to mind are the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, or the Noble Eightfold Path. So starting with the Four Noble Truths, and this is actually something that really isn't covered by any kind of sloppy interpretation of Buddhism or any kind of marketing interpretation. And the Four Noble Truths are basically, the first one is understanding the truth of suffering. So life is in some way full of suffering, whether that's yourself or others around you. Suffering, however, largely, this is the second one, comes from desire and wanting. I know you and I have discussed this in full on previous podcasts as well, Brother Bear. Sort of I think you termed, there was a term for it, the something trap, whereby you're chasing, in a lot of people's cases, materialistic gains, but very quickly you go back to baseline. So that's your second noble truth. The third, which is my favorite, is that the suffering stops when your desire and wanting stops. So that sort of encourages you to really enjoy what you have around you, not focus on what you don't have. Obviously, that's way easier said than done. But it's certainly an interesting aspiration, because the mindset shifts to, okay, instead of focusing on what I don't have and what I want, we're focusing on the things I've been given or I've worked for, and how far I've come. And then the fourth...
Sorry, go on.
I was going to say about the fourth one just being to stop the desires and wants, you follow onto the Eightfold Path. But we'll go on to that next after you've said what you were going to say.
Yeah, I was just going to say the gratitude one I think is so key. I've noticed that personally is gratitude. Obviously, you can't really hold two feelings or thoughts at the same time, but there is the idea that if you can hold a prolonged feeling of gratitude and it comes from a genuine place, it sort of staves off feelings of, depression or anxiety, because you just can't be grateful and depressed at the same time. They're mutually exclusive in that sense. And the other thing is that I'm completely, if on the flip side of being grateful, there's like you said, if we see some success, we acclimatize to it all too quickly. At that point, if the same success or the same sort of, bonus is received next year, it is not seen in the same level of gratefulness and sort of met with the same happiness at all. And so, your baseline sort of goes up and it erodes your enjoyment and gratefulness centers, if that makes any sense. So it erodes your baseline in terms of what makes you truly happy and fulfilled. And I think we have more control over that baseline than we'd like to lead ourselves to believe.
So you think that there's actually the capacity to control and be aware of that baseline more than people are generally aware of?
I think we have the capacity, and whether it's because we don't want to really know, because we realise that baseline has sort of strayed grossly away from where we would say we're not grateful for all the basic things we have and all the amazing things. We had a great education, great jobs, and all this stuff, and people would kill to have this. So we're almost embarrassed to do that level of introspection, to the point of where we realise that we should be in most cases a hell of a lot more grateful than we are. I think that's a healthy exercise, albeit a painful one, maybe.
Definitely, because it begs humility of you, and
yes,
it's one. The problem is as well, I think, and this comes back to what we were saying about being in the moment as opposed to always thinking of the next thing, the future thing. I think the issue we face in modern society is that it's almost seen as a weakness to be content with what you have and grateful for what you have. We say, be grateful for your family, for your health and things like that. But on a materialistic level, I think this is why I enjoy the Four Noble Truths, because I actually think that that's the aspect of modern Buddhism that's often left out. People, when they say I practice Buddhist ideas or practice Buddhist activities, they're talking about yoga, they're talking about being Zen. It's very sexy to talk about those things. It's, you can broadcast that on your social media, but the issue is you're completely missing the point. It's not about broadcasting your own achievements in Buddhism. That was kind of the opposite of the original teachings. It's about recognizing that there is suffering in the world. You're one of those people suffering because you're always wanting and desiring more. How can you address that?
It's an interesting. I suppose that the desire thing, that's true to an extent, but it's maybe not true of someone who genuinely has nothing, right? So I think it's true for anyone who's already had their basic needs met, as in shelter, food. But until those needs are met, I think, desires are, at least until then, those desires are warranted, right? To have the basics.
It should be justified.
Right. So I think maybe at some point after that, then you can question on a case-by-case basis of how much your unhappiness is being driven by desires of superfluous materialistic stuff. And I think that probably applies to the vast majority of Western society, for example. Yeah,
definitely. And I think this is where Buddhism, and this is an issue I've come to, is where Buddhism is at odds with materialism. And I don't mean materialism as in just consumption and purchasing things. I just mean the pursuit of, I suppose, political or social ideas that focus on, reinvestment in the self of, monetary gains or materialistic gains. And that could literally just be, for example, in an unequal society, having socialist ideas. It could be something as simple as that. That's a materialistic concept. I think wages should be this much higher. I think UBI is a good idea. But I think when we're looking at, say, a sort of developing world lens, and we're talking about areas where people don't have enough clean water, then suddenly the conversation is very different.
Yeah, exactly. But I think, if we assume the Western context, which this, absolutely applies to for the vast majority, it's an interesting one, because the vast majority of people have those basic needs met. And I've also seen a subtle sort of push away from maybe physical material goods to, justifying more money for the sake of, you can be quite conniving with yourself as to why you want more money. And today it's maybe not so much the physical assets and goods and shoes and whatever. It's maybe a little bit more around seemingly the motives for money hiding behind a veil of seemingly noble aims and aspirations, such as freedom and traveling. And I just want to be free. I just want to have the choice of to work or not to work, or where I want to work, or having that dream job. Having the choice sort of to take my time and find myself, and then, deciding what career path I should go down or what I'm best suited to. And I'm sure there's some merit to that, but I think it's also like a slithery Ouroboros finding its way to justify capital accumulation. How dare they?
So sort of like a backdoor way of justifying that.
Yes, through more supposedly noble aspirations.
Yeah, sort of less obviously materialistic, or less sort of tangibly materialistic aspirations.
And I think that might be a step in the right direction. It's probably better than just, I want some New Balenciagas. But
well, I think it carries more storytelling. It carries more depth, hopefully more depth as a result of that. And I was going to say it's less burdensome on the environment, but obviously the burden of traveling is huge, so forget about that. But I know what you're saying. Like, it's something different, it's new, and there seems to be a greater pursuit of depth in pursuing experiences and principles, as opposed to just objects.
Yeah, and the common denominator with all the above I listed was really the luxury of choice, of being able to take a gap year whenever you like, the ability to live wherever you want in the world and not really worry about money. I think the ultimate ability and freedom to be completely mobile and do whatever you want.
Yeah, I think it's taking off that pressure, isn't it? And the smarter people have figured out that actually the constant climb for higher wages to spend more, that presents you with less disposable income in the end, so therefore you get that Ouroboros, back to the constant demand for higher wages. I think the smarter people are sort of putting that to one side, and actually taking different paths. That doesn't necessarily have to be one involving pursuing experiences and travel, but just different ideas in what to do with their money and their lives, and actually in a way putting their own pursuits and passions first.
Yes, and I think probably the best way to look at it is maybe you can be a bit more, hopefully the next iteration is being more altruistic in those aspirations. So maybe not so much about just me traveling, but it actually somehow contributing to the communities you touch globally, and whether in some meaningful, tangible way. I don't know how there's probably a plethora of ways you could do that, but it's an interesting one for sure.
Yeah, it is, and that actually brings me on to the Eightfold Path, because that's more granular, and that's a little bit more about lifestyle choices. So that sort of the Four Noble Truths ends on, basically stopping these desires and wants that cause suffering through the path. And as part of that, there's your right intention and freeing your mind of bad thoughts, right speech, so reducing words or language that hurt others, right action, which is working for the good of others, right livelihood, respecting life, right effort, resisting evil, right concentration, which is practicing meditation, right mindfulness, which we've covered already, controlling your thoughts, and then the final one, which is actually the most ambiguous, which a lot of people like, is the right view, knowing truth, and that's where it sort of becomes the religion of no religion, because everyone has their own idea of truth. For one, it may be, just pursuing unrelentlessly science and scientific progress. For someone else, it may be the divine worship of an Abrahamic God. So, there's many different ways to look at that, but that's how we can perhaps take the Eightfold Path to be more altruistic and to lead a life that basically makes you happier and makes others happier around you.
Yeah, and I think people are quickly starting to realise that. I mean, at least I think we're firmly in that stage of where we realise material possessions, at least for those enlightened among us, I really don't bring much in the way of happiness. Once the basic needs have been met in terms of physical possessions, and you're adequately sheltered and clothed, for me at least, there's sort of not a huge amount of joy derived from additional possessions, because they're quite quickly, at that point, they're quite superfluous, other than if they, sort of pertain to a hobby or something that brings you great joy. But yeah, other than that, they quite quickly become quite vacuous, right? So I think maybe moving to freedoms and being able to be more mobile and footloose geographically, and sort of being able to help more, that those are all sort of aspirations that are tending in the right direction.
Yeah, and I think that the material possession has to have a feedback loop into personal development. It could be a hobby, it could be greater stability, greater freedom, fill in the blank that makes you happy. But you need to have that feedback loop in order to, warrant them better than baseline. But yeah, these are interesting aspirations as well, freedom and helping others, caring for others, and I suppose all of these ideas are quite Zen in their nature, and would certainly fall under the sort of Buddhist banner in terms of how living the Buddhist life or living the Zen way.
Yeah, and so going right back to where these sort of seeming deficiencies, or what we perceive to be deficiencies, or the root of the unhappiness in terms of these desires or unfulfilled desires, what's the proposed solution, or is there one that seems to prevail or come from Buddhism and its teachings?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, because as it can be accused of being a vague doctrine, or a vague set of ideas, you can often be left with Buddhism feeling like, well, what do I do now? The kind of what do I do now syndrome of, well, how do I improve myself and others around me? I think, the two concrete ways, and this comes back to sort of your Alan Watts, is just understanding the level of oneness between yourself and the environment around you, and the people around you, the trees, the oceans, friends and family, or just everyday people on the street. And that oneness is twofold in its effects. So on one side of things, once you presumably achieve that oneness, you suffer a great deal more, because you feel the environment suffering and you feel the people around you suffering. But in another way, that leads you to take action and following sort of the Eightfold Path on one side. And once you follow that path, you're, in theory, going to be living a more fulfilling life that is governed by kindness, the right action, the right effort, the right view, and so on. So that's the action side to it. And then on a personal level, we'd be looking at just that internal comfort of mindfulness. And once you get to that level of mindfulness, for some people, I mean, I'm sure a lot of people never reach, nirvana or whatever you want to call it, but you can work towards a level of mindfulness that helps you realize that, on any given day, if all you need is your bedroom, and there's never been a more important time to have this conversation, but if all you need is your bedroom to meditate in, and a minimal amount of food and water, as insane as that sounds, if you can bring it down to that purest level, then anything on top of that is a sort of a beautiful bonus.
Yeah.
Does that somewhat answer your question?
It does somewhat answer my question. Yeah, I think sort of the two teachings, one of trying to focus less of your mind's bandwidth on desires, and the pursuit of those desires frees up, in turn, bandwidth for more altruistic pursuits, external to yourself, other people, nature as a whole, the planet. And if everyone were to pursue that philosophy, that teaching, then it would, by definition, lift everyone up.
Yes, exactly. If we're to extrapolate that and put it on a societal level, it definitely would do. But you're right in separation there of your intrinsic and your extrinsic. Your intrinsic is your mindfulness, and your extrinsic is your Eightfold Path and how you treat others around you and the environment around you. So that can be, the way you talk to your colleagues, the way you treat, say, the environment and the nature around you. The intrinsic is a more selfish and self-serving, but still important aspect of this. And that could be, when you're down at the archery range or when you're doing the dishes.
And so, Brother Bear, how come are these Buddhist teachings something you've always been interested in and somewhat informed on, or is it something you've pursued more recently?
Well, I haven't actually pursued these as much as I have wanted to recently. I first became aware of Buddhism as a child because we have in my hometown in Milton Keynes the
MK represent.
Represent MK, bruv. We have, I believe it's the first ever peace pagoda in the Western world.
No
so,
way.
Yeah, and that's I am scrambling to find the date that it was constructed, but I think it was in the early 80s. And that is situated next to a very large Buddhist temple that is has a beautiful lake with some koi in it, and it's a beautiful ornate building with Japanese style architecture, and it's run by a group of Buddhist monks. So I would go down there with my mum for Buddha's birthday and various other meditation sessions, but that was just sort of, I wasn't really greatly aware of the teachings of Buddhism until I became an adult. And sort of 2013 or 14, a friend of mine very much got me into the teachings of it and how you can enact these teachings in your day-to-day life.
That's fascinating. I'm just looking at a picture of it now. It's quite a beautiful, serene area. It's just by a little lake or pond, right?
Yes, it's by Willen Lake. So it's a very beautiful artificial lake, actually, in Milton Keynes. I mean, everything's artificial there, but the Peace Pagoda is one of the only, I suppose, on the horizon. It's a very distinctive feature, and it's a very spiritual place. They do lantern releases there for Buddha's birthday and a bunch of other celebrations.
That's
but
so fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, have you had much of a exposure to Buddhism over the years, Brother Bear, or is it something that you're just getting into?
No, not a huge amount. It's an interesting interesting and it's an interesting how flexible it is and how accommodating it is. Just looking at the Peace Pagoda at Willen Lake, completed in September 1980. We just had the 40-year anniversary, Brobear.
Ah, happy birthday. Happy birthday, Pagoda. Yeah, I thought it was I was going to say 1982, but 1980.
Wrong, 1980.
Wrong.
But we must go there for the 50th year anniversary. 10 years' time.
I'd love to go there and celebrate the Tao with you, Brother Bear.
Well, for me, Brother Bear, going back to your question, I haven't heard or been in close proximity to Buddhism, other through various high-quality documentaries on YouTube, and this old flatmate of mine whose brother was a monk, and just about people's own experiences, going to these Buddhist retreats, silent retreats, and then my psychologist, who also was very much into the Buddhist teachings, particularly adopted the mindfulness practices of Buddhism, or a lot of them that stem from Buddhism and Eastern philosophy. And I think this is an interesting area within psychology, because I think mindfulness as a practice and Zen and the meditation is something that's increasingly mainstream and seen as a very powerful way to heal.
Yes. Yeah. Great that you use the word heal there, Brother Bear. That's it's a brilliant aspiration that comes with Buddhism and meditative practice. Healing the soul, healing those around you.
Yeah.
And Brother Bear, tell me more about how you came across Alan Watts and what you've learned from him, because I feel like we've often dropped his name in discussions, whether it's been at the pub or, just on walks or whatever. We've actually talked about him, but I've never really got from you, where you found out about Alan Watts. I was really not surprised, but he's not someone everyone knows. So how did you find out about him?
So it was, I think, for looking at, as many years ago now, before uni or around uni time, probably sort of high school years, looking at YouTube, and I was looking at things around Buddhism, and I just found him such a charismatic figure, even if it was only the audio. But I'm so grateful he recorded all of these lectures, and it was just fascinating of what he was saying, and so difficult to re-articulate his words because he was such an articulate man himself, and I could never do it justice. But it's amazing what he was saying, and so much of it sort of, you've got common themes within Alan Watts, like overthinking and the monkey mind and things. He'd almost talk you through, if I really listened in and tuned into his words, which I did on a number of occasions. There was one particular time I remember I tuned in when I was on a train, and he talked about how you almost look at reality, I suppose, life is this show, right? And there's some people who are extremely involved in this game, and he talks about them in the analogy of they're really far out at sea. You can still see them from the beach, but the people on the beach realize this is all a game, and it's all a bit, at the end of the day, quite hilarious that we're going about playing these funny roles and going to offices and wearing these suits. It's all quite amusing for someone who, because there's two ways to live life, right? There's one that you're the people who play the game. Well, there's the people who go mental. They realize it's a game and they can't handle it. and then there's the people who obviously are in the game and fully immersed in it and don't really realize it, or have even the time or second, or don't give the time to step back and realize what they're in, which is 99.9% of people, I'd say. And then there's the people who realize it's a game but play it anyway because they realize that's the best way to be in a world and to function as a useful and productive member of society. So there's those who so that was an interesting sort of piece that I remember him talking about.
I think Bill Hicks has sort of got his own interpretation of that, where he calls it the ride. And there's a great video on YouTube with him summarizing that as sort of a ride or a roller coaster, and just the acknowledgement that it's just a game or it's just a ride.
It's a play, and we're all actors.
Yeah, exactly. There's many metaphors you can use for it. But I think the third one, of what you said, the third outcome, sort of those that recognize that it's a game, but still they play it because they know it's, it gives them the highest level of functionality in society. But their awareness allows them to step back and actually just be taken by sort of the Zen lily of life and float a little bit and not get too worked up by these things.
No, and not overthink it. This is a beautiful, incredible place and universe you live in, and how lucky. You really have one. So why not enjoy it while you're here, whatever it is, and then see what happens in the next one.
Yeah, exactly. And as Alan Watts said, he says better luck next time round.
Exactly. Oh well, screwed up this time. Better luck in the next life.
Exactly. And it's the Alan Watts story is so interesting because he was a theology student, started off as a Episcopal priest, believe it or not, and it was only when he left his ministry he became more engaged with sort of Zen movements and Asian studies. I think his timing was brilliant as well because he sort of entered the sort of spiritual, spiritual teaching market when the hippie counterculture.
I was just going to say the hippie movement. He was a bit of a hippie, wasn't he? Really.
He was a bit of a hippie, but I think he was at odds with the hippie counterculture movement in that he...
Not to trivialize him, but
No, certainly not to trivialize him. He was definitely involved in it as sort of a yogi character, and he did explore psychedelics. But what his point that he rallied around was that, you can meditate, you can experience mindfulness, you can experience different disciplines, to reach those Zen levels, or you can just take a pill or a tab of acid to get there. And I think what I always took from Alan Watts is his critique of laziness in that aspect of exploring human consciousness. And actually what's far more fulfilling in mindfulness is discipline.
Yes, absolutely. There's many quotes I think where it is about discipline. There's one particular, it's like, if you're not really in control of you if you don't have discipline or something. You're not the master of your own self if you're not disciplined. I think it actually comes from that great marathon runner Eliud Kipchoge. He's the record holder. Anyway, I diverge. But yes.
No. Very, very. No, but that's a very sort of appropriate comment there. Appropriate quote. And Ted Nugent, the crazy bastard as he is, one of my favorite quotes by him is, when he was in the 60s, the hippies were all saying, you need to explore human consciousness, but you can't because of all these pressures in life, because of work. All these pressures have led us to drinking and taking drugs. And his comment to that was, you know what, fuck those pressures. You be the source of pressure. You get behind the bow and arrow and you shoot. That level of discipline is how you overcome those pressures. You don't give in to those pressures through, just a tab of acid at the weekend.
Yes, and this is like the same two sides of the same coin. People think they're free when they're allowed to do whatever they want, and whatever they want is often just sitting on the couch and doing nothing. And actually, it's the opposite. It's actually when you force yourself to do things you don't want, that's when you're free. And this is what Eliud says. It's just a simple quote. All he says is, the only disciplined ones in life are free. Only the disciplined ones in life are free.
That's an excellent statement. Yeah, and you've had other people who've thought and made relevant comments. I mean, Joe Rogan also talks
all
about
over the shop. Yeah, I've seen echoes of that same statement or sentiment everywhere. Exactly. It's like discipline frees you.
It does free you. And Joe Rogan talks about the real high in life being disciplined and being really a servant to your goals. And when you achieve them, then you truly feel that level of freedom. There's so many echoes of that. You can quote Thomas Jefferson in the development of the U.S. Constitution, where he does not separate freedom from responsibility. I mean, in my opinion, and I'm sure I'd get a lot of criticism for this, but I feel like there's echoes of Buddhism all throughout the U.S. Constitution, especially for its time. The concepts of responsibility and treating others right, freedom, but also having that level, that middle way that isn't at odds with complete, some level of indulgence. I feel like that kind of sentiment, as you say, has just been echoed throughout documents and videos and podcasts throughout history.
Yeah, absolutely. It's everywhere, isn't it? It's like this one common denominator you see repeated throughout history, throughout ages, and with people from all walks of life, right? Everything from athletes through to the people who wrote the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what I wanted to get across with this podcast is that Buddhism can be found everywhere, and in everyone. Whatever your political beliefs, whatever your other spiritual commitments are, it's less so a set of dogma or doctrines, and it's more about pursuing that middle way, walking the Tao, and then you get your structure from following the Eightfold Path as best you can, and having in the back of your mind those noble truths, so you don't become I suppose, a slave to your own self-loathing or your own self-righteousness.
Yeah, exactly, because that's such a common trap, especially these days. And, the comparison is the thief of joy. I think that rings true, particularly with today's age of social media. That's all too easy to do, even for those of us who actively try and avoid it.
Absolutely, yeah. It's often to be limited because it is inescapable to some degree. But yeah, comparison is the thief of joy. And
it's actually often what, generates these desires or phony desires, right? It's kind of what he's got. I mean, it arguably is the only thing that creates these desires, particularly ones that don't have a true or valuable end in mind, or don't have a real treasure at the end.
Yes, definitely.
Materialistic, particularly, right?
Definitely, and there's so many situations where you've been content with your day, your week, your month, and then you see someone with something on social media, and you think, I want that, and it's something you never even considered wanting before. But where has that come from? And it's come from the ego, and it's come from comparison.
Yeah, exactly.
So the beauty of Buddhism, which I'd love anyone listening to take home, is that it's not about self-perfection. It's not about ultimate divinity. It's about the aspiration to treat others right, reduce suffering, and ultimately live in absolute reality.
Beautiful words, Brother Bear.
I think we'll leave it there, Brother Bear.
Glorious. Well, that rounds out 2020, doesn't it? And that's a lovely podcast to end on, Brotherly Bear.
Yes, I hope so. I wanted to leave people with some spiritual guidance. I think it's good to hit pause, and I think that was a nice neutral way to end this crazy year, this crazy rodeo of a year.
It's been one crazy rodeo, that's for sure. I don't want another ride on that, thanks.
No. Get me off now.
2021, here we come, ladies and gentlemen. It's been an absolute pleasure. 2020 has been a significant year for Brobears Talk. Brobears Talk has launched 16 podcasts ago now. Wow, we've been going strong, Brother Bear.
Yeah, this was our inaugural year, and cheers to many more going forward in 2021.
Absolutely relentless. Every 2 weeks. Pa-pow!
Pow!
See you on the next one.
Thank you for listening, everyone.
Over and out.
Till next time.
Happy New Year.